Hello and welcome to this edition of AACRAO's Credential Chats. We are excited to be joined this week by Jan Schreck. She is the Senior Associate Vice Provost for Academic Affairs at Johns Hopkins University. Jan, thank you so much for joining us.
Happy to be here, Noah. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And, let's just dive right into just your role regarding, the credential innovation at Johns Hopkins and what Johns Hopkins is, starting to get off to the races with adopting and implementing.
Yeah, happy to do that. So my role in the provost office is pretty widespread, but one of the things I do is pick up new initiatives on behalf of the provost and the president. And so non-decree, not credit work had been underway in terms of some central coordination at Hopkins for about the past 5 years. So we don't have a continuing ed school. We don't have a professional school. We have 10 schools doing little bits of non-degree and non-credit and starting to think about micro-credentialing on their own. That occurring in an already decentralized university put up some flags both for risk, but also opportunity. So right now, my job is to pull together those 10 schools and the leaders for non-degree, non-credit from those schools, figure out how we can build out micro-credentialing and build out all of the technology infrastructure to support that non-degree, non-credit work. And I'm here to tell you, Noah, I'm going on record. We're about to really scale up. So we are going through a branding exercise. We're about to brand our non-degree, non-credit offerings kind of in a Hopkins sub-brand. We are launching two new technology platforms, one for micro-credentialing and one for registration, billing, and a shared catalog. And we are building toolkits for our schools to be able to kind of scale up in all these areas. So it's an exciting time at Hopkins for this kind of work. I think we're a little behind in some ways, but we're doing the leapfrog. Like we're trying to leap ahead fairly quickly.
Well, thank you for that sort of overview to kick us off. And I think that so many of us feel, whether it's imposter syndrome or like we're way behind everybody else. And I think that anybody who we would look at who's ahead of us would say, I feel like I'm really far behind. But it's sort of interesting, because it does sound like you're not necessarily unique what you're doing with it at Hopkins with this decentralization, not necessarily unique with, well, everybody was kind of doing it their own way. We didn't have a single Hopkins way of doing, non-degree, non-credit. I'm curious, as you spin up these new ways of doing, what are you finding that what's old is new, that it's not, necessarily starting from scratch, but actually kind of implementing things that are not totally new?
Yeah, that's a great question, Noah. And I think, when I think about working at Hopkins and sort of the spirit of Hopkins, we're a school of innovation, right? One of the reasons we are purposely decentralized is to give a lot of autonomy to our faculty and to our individual schools to be able to move quickly and to be innovative, both in the research space and the education space. So when you look at how our traditional credit bearing, degree academic programs are governed, they are governed primarily by the schools. So even though my office centrally will ultimately submit a new academic program out to the Council of Deans for review and to our Maryland Higher Education Commission, the bulk of all the approvals is happening at the school level. And so as we look to build up our non-degree and non-credit and our micro-credentialing, we were thinking like, we're going to follow the exact same pattern, right? We're not going to put more central guards into something like non-degree and non-credit where we want people to be quick and innovative and be able to create something really quickly. That's, market ready and change kind of on the dime without having to go through 16 layers of, faculty governance to get approval. So I think that was one piece of what we already knew was like, why break a culture and a system that was already in place? So now our schools are currently looking at their curriculum review processes and how they do academic programs. And they're deciding how they're going to do that for non-degree, non-credit, and micro-credentialing. So I think Hopkins has a really good pattern of what we call in the provost office, establishing guardrails, right? We don't give a ton of mandates, but we give kind of guardrails. Like if you stay within here, you can do anything in between these guardrails and you'll be okay. And that's what we're building for non-degree, non-credit is sort of that shared infrastructure, that set of guardrails around things like what are the guiding principles, what are best practices that we want to see in that work. We have shared definitions, but we're giving the schools a lot of autonomy to be able to operate within those guardrails.
And so it almost sounds a little bit like, hey, we want to be here to foster innovation. We want to support you. And the one string we want to tie to your balloons as you're dreaming big is just consistency of what this looks like. So it's not every school has its own version of this, but there is a consistent framework, and we're not here to intervene out of the provost's office as subject matter experts, but really just to make sure that what is a micro-credential is consistent, and that the word micro-credential is not some open sesame magic word to circumvent governance.
Absolutely, because when we started doing the micro-credentials work, we had a work group that looked at both internal and external sort of research, right? We are a research institution, so we started with researching. When we looked at all the publications put out by AACRAO, AACRAO, workforce credentialing reports, what you could see is there's a lot of confusion, right, about what credentials mean out in the play, external workforce in place. And so we thought, well, we can't really fix that, right? Like, we're Hopkins, but we can't fix that. But what we can do is make sure our definition of a micro-credential and what those micro-credentials are consistent, and that they're branded consistently, and that they mean something in the world that's consistent, right? They're always going to have metadata. If you earn a particular micro-credentials from Hopkins, you're going to know that means that we did some kind of assessment of a skill or a knowledge or ability that's documented in that. And so we can only sort of control our piece of the micro-credential puzzle. And truthfully, the other thing we're telling all of our faculty that are working on this is we have a brand. Hopkins is a brand that's well known. It's associated with a particular level of quality. And we're going to maintain that quality as we add kind of this new world into the ecosphere of what's offered for education in Hopkins.
And I'm sort of enthusiastically nodding with you, Ted, because I hear my boss, Christy Will McCormick at CU Boulder, and it is about consistency, meaningfulness, and worthiness of the university brand. And something else you said there that got me really excited was the metadata word, which I think that is something that, in my mind, maybe it's because the vendors are not necessarily doing all they could on the client success of educating people, but it's a place where I think there's just so much opportunity for leadership from AACRAO members, frankly, to help campuses see, hey, these can be just digital PDFs kind of what would have been printed out on vellum paper, or because of the metadata, like, we can actually contextualize this and really, make way more transparent what the credential is credentialing, and tell this broader story. And it sounds like at Hopkins, that's not being left to chance, that it is a very intentional thing that our credentials are going to be telling these stories. Like, tell more about, say just a little bit more about that for people who have no idea what we're talking about when we say metadata.
Sure.
And then maybe just how easy or hard that was to kind of get people to be on board with.
So I think we all think about, LinkedIn, and you see that I earned this badge, I earned that badge. Like, I joke, my phone gives me a badge every other day for you closed your rings for 3 times, right? And so I think, what's really important to us at Hopkins, it has been in our comprehensive learner record journey, it is in our micro-credentialing journey, is that we are actually documenting the learning that's occurring in association with whatever credential we're offering. And I think, for non-degree, non-credit, that's a little bit of a sell, because sometimes those offerings aren't designed to do that. So we built into our micro-credential framework, we have 3 levels. And the first one's a micro-credential of completion. And the baseline for that is you showed up, you did something, and we're going to have you evaluate the course, but we didn't actually assess anything in the course. So we know that micro-credential, when you see it as a prospective employer, you're going to know that meant Noah was there, but we're not validating that he learned anything. We're just validating that he actually showed up. We then have 2 levels above that. One's a micro-credential of competence. And so in that one, the requirement is you had to have assessed at least one outcome or skill or ability as part of that non-degree, non-credit offering. And that will be what is actually the metadata that accompanies that micro-credential. And then we have another stackable 3rd level called a micro-credential of achievement, which is saying that it has to have happened across more than one offering, and you are now assessing usually a broader set of competencies or skills. And again, that will be attached to the metadata. So I'm not good at explaining metadata, except to say that that digital representation of your learning will include data that shows what is that like competency you achieved and how do we know that you did it. And we're going to stamp it as Hopkins to say, we assessed it, we're maintaining a record of that assessment. And, we're validating that this person actually demonstrated the ability to complete an R problem solving set. That wasn't a great example, but something that,
That's a
is
great, I think that's a great one. Because I'm frankly, maybe it's just validation because we have one around coding in R. But I, when you talk about the assessment piece, is that something that people are just getting? Because I sometimes run into, proposals where they'll say, well, they have to have gotten 80% or higher on 3 out of the 5 quizzes, and there maybe is some kind of friction there. Well, what are those 5 quizzes cuisine? What if we
yeah,
just say that? And then, because what is an 80% or higher? What's the difference between a 79 and an 81%? Or, what if we
assessments.
just,
Yeah, the age-old question of all higher ed, right? Like I think, and it's interesting, my unit in the provost office actually oversees assessment across the entire university for learning. So in some ways, I think people are used to dealing with us and having us ask those questions. I do think it's raising interesting conversations. So we have a university advisory committee now on non-degree, non-credit micro-credentials. So it's the lead from each of the 10 schools. And they're talking to each other, right? Because they had to come up with these approval processes within their schools. And because we're rolling out these new systems, we have to have some agreement on like, what does it look like to have these? So, I think as in all things, we've got some exemplars of really strong assessment, and we've got some, folks that might have a little bit of room to grow to be able to do that. We also have a wide variety of disciplines, right, who view assessment very differently. So we have, our bench science people in engineering and in our School of Medicine, but then we have our Peabody Conservatory of Music and Dance who view assessment very differently than we do. And so I think it's another place to also sort of bring in that lens of different kinds of learning. Actually, I've learned more from my performance folks in the Peabody Institute than any place else because, what they're assessing is constant formative, real-time assessment of things that are really difficult to make tangible. So anyway, I think it's a great point, and I think it's something we're going to have to be careful with in higher ed moving forward because I don't know that all non-degree, non-credit micro-credentials have been constructed with that attention, but those are built into the approval processes in the school. So, one of the things is, I've said to each of the leads for the schools, you're the person I'm calling if I catch wind that there is a micro-credential going out and people are like, I can just get this. You're going to have to come back and tell me, just like I do if we have complaints about academic programs, right? I'm going to come to you because you're the one who's approving this, and it's your reputation and the Hopkins reputation on the line. So I do feel like people are bought into it. I think it's going to be a little more challenging as we scale up to figure out the assessments that are also friendly for non-degree, non-credit, so we don't start just throwing typical academic assessments into a non-degree, non-credit setting. Like, I think that's going to be some of the part we have to work on.
and I know we just have another minute left, so just briefly, you touched on something that I think is a great bridge. I know that in addition to this role, you also are involved in compliance work, accreditation work, and so just as you're looking at the landscape, both not just at Hopkins but also just more broadly, at Convergence, you heard people talking about, well, we're very distinctly doing this non-credit, and we are trying to avoid doing anything that would fall under the auspice of accreditation stuff. And, I'm curious, would you kind of say, whoa, to that, that accreditors are absolutely going to be paying attention to this, or is that a good move? And just, just sort of landscape wise, what do you see? And as you wear that hat, what kind of to this space?
So I have to first say, the accreditation world right now is really hard to predict, right? There's just so much going on at the federal level that it's like looking into a murky crystal ball. But if things were the way I think they should be, I think non-degree, non-credit, and micro-credentials are going to and need to become, again, like a permanent part of the ecosphere, let's speak, of higher education. And if that's the case and accreditation remains a thing, I think we're all foolish to think at some point there's not going to be some focus from accreditors. I will say this about accreditation at Hopkins. We always say we don't do things because of accreditation. Like we do things the way we should do them for Hopkins. And if they don't meet the accreditation standards, then we're doing something really wrong. And that's how I feel about non-degree, non-credit, and micro-credentials. I had a team member who did one of the first NECHI, so the New England Commission on Higher Education has been piloting accreditation for non-degree, non-credit. One of my team members served on one of those first teams. The recommendations they make for what makes good quality programs are really sound. Like even if we never go after accreditation, we use them as a toolkit to show our programs because it includes things like we were just talking about, like you should have learning outcomes. You should have some kind of assessment built in. Like you should be thinking about accessibility of your material, right? It's all good practice. So I think for that reason, we're, at some point we may pursue it, but I just think, again, don't do things because of the accreditors. You do things because the guidance that, like the standard that holds you to is what the standard is that you want to be. But I suspect it will come at some point. And I kind of welcome it. I think higher ed often needs a good shove, like a really big shove, to go in directions it needs to go. And I think this needs to happen. And if we can sort of speed up the external validity of that, I don't think that's a bad thing. That doesn't scare me, but maybe that's because I deal with accreditation.
I love that answer to end on. Janet Schreck from Johns Hopkins University. Thank you for taking the time to share your wisdom and wit with AACRAO's Credential Chats.
Happy to hear it. Thanks, Noah. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. And to anyone watching this, thank you for sharing your time and engagement with us. And we hope everybody has a badge-worthy week. So long.